The hand that held the reins was not large, but the knuckles were white against the cracked brown leather, a line of pale hills on a sun-scorched map of skin. Dust rose in a fine ochre cloud from the hooves of the horse. A creature so tired its head hung low enough to brush the tips of the sage, and the dust settled on the rider's worn trousers, on the faded blue of her shirt, on the dark hair that had escaped its binding, to whip across her face in the ceaseless wind. She was a small shape, in a vast and indifferent landscape, a punctuation mark against a sentence of endless sky and baked earth, and the town ahead was little more than a smudge of heat-shimmer and shadow, a place that might be a salvation, or just another kind of emptiness. It made no difference. The horse had to drink. She had to rest. The sun beat down with the weight of a physical blow, a great hot hand pressing her into the saddle, and every mile had been earned with a stiffness in her back and a burn in her thighs, a testament to the simple, brutal arithmetic of distance and endurance. She did not look around at the mesas that stood like silent, rust-colored judges, nor did she look back at the trail that had worn her down to this essential, moving core of will. She looked only forward, at the smudge that slowly resolved itself into the hard lines of wooden buildings, a geometry of survival stark against the organic chaos of the plains. There was a livery, a general store, a saloon whose bat-winged doors seemed to yawn like a lazy mouth, and a blacksmith's forge from which a rhythmic, metallic heartbeat pulsed into the thick afternoon air. The town had a name, but names were luxuries. What it had was water. That was all that mattered. The horse felt the change, its ears twitching forward, a low nicker rumbling in its chest, a promise of an end to the walking. The rider offered no comfort, no soft word, her energy conserved for the transactions to come, because she knew that arriving was not the same as being welcome, and that thirst was a currency everyone understood, but not everyone honored. She was an outsider, a stray, and the silence that greeted her as she rode down the single dusty street was a different kind of silence than the one she had left behind in the wilderness. It was a watchful silence, a measuring one, coming from the shadows of porches and the dark interiors of windows, where faces she could not see were taking the sum of her worn-out horse, and the small, tight bundle tied behind her saddle. They were calculating her worth, or her weakness. She felt their eyes like insects on her skin. She stopped. From the heat and clangor of his forge, Silas saw her arrive. He did not stop the hammer's fall, its rhythm as ingrained as his own breathing, but his eyes, accustomed to the bright heart of the fire, registered the slight shift in the relentless afternoon glare as her shape broke the long, empty line of the street. He saw the tired horse, the slump of the rider's shoulders, the way she sat motionless for a long moment, letting the town look its fill. He had seen hundreds like her over the years, drifters pushed by winds of misfortune or poor judgment, their stories written in the frayed cuffs of their clothes and the hunger that hollowed out their eyes. They came seeking work, or a handout, or trouble, and they usually found one of the three before moving on. Their passage is brief and unremarkable as a summer storm that darkens the sky for an hour and then is gone, leaving behind only the smell of wet dust. He finished the curve on the horseshoe, the metal glowing a furious, tamed orange, and plunged it into the quenching trough with a violent hiss of steam that clouded the air with the smell of scorched iron and water. Only then did he allow himself to pause, leaning on the handle of his hammer, his forearms thick with muscle and slick with sweat, the soot on his face accentuating the lines the sun had carved around his eyes. He was a man made of solid, deliberate motions, his world contained by the heat of the forge, the weight of the hammer, and the predictable resistance of hot steel. He had built a life here out of fire and force, a quiet life walled in by the sheer physical effort of his trade, and he wanted no part of the town's petty cruelties or its fleeting dramas. He watched as the rider, a woman he now saw as she swung a leg over, dismounted with a weary grace. She was young, younger than he'd thought from a distance, and there was a stillness about her that was not the same as the exhaustion of her horse. It was a coiled stillness, a waiting. He saw her run a hand down the horse's neck, a gesture of quiet communion, before she took up the reins and began to lead the animal toward the livery. He saw Blevins and his two shadows, Cobb and Riley, detach themselves from the porch of the saloon, their laughter carrying on the hot air, thin and sharp. They were vultures in human skin, circling anything that looked weak, their cruelty a casual sport born of boredom and entitlement. Silas turned back to his forge. He picked up a new length of iron with his tongs. It was not his business. He had learned, the hard way, that making things your business was the surest way to unmake your own peace. The iron went into the coals. He worked the bellows, and the fire roared, hungry for the metal, eager to make it yield. Afternoon. The heat did not break, it deepened, settling into the dust in the wooden planks of the town, until the air itself felt solid, something to be pushed through. Alara left her horse in the grudging care of the liveryman, a sour-faced man who took her last 2 coins without a word and spat a stream of tobacco juice near her boots as she turned to leave. She had a few cents left, enough for a handful of oats for the horse, and maybe a piece of hardtack for herself, but not enough for a room. Not yet. She walked toward the general store, her steps measured, her gaze sweeping the street, cataloging the faces that turned away as she approached, the sudden silences that fell in her wake. She was a stone dropped into a still pond, and the ripples of suspicion and appraisal spread out from her. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smells of coffee beans, cured leather, and dust. The storekeeper, a man with a soft belly and hard little eyes, watched her from behind the counter as she moved past the barrels of flour and sugar. She did not look at the tinned peaches or the bolts of calico. She went to the sacks of grain, her touch light as she tested the texture of the oats through the rough burlap. "Just that," she said, her voice low and unused, and she gestured to a small scoop. The storekeeper's eyes flickered to the door, where a shadow had fallen. Blevins stood there, flanked by his men, his thumbs hooked in his belt, a lazy smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. He was handsome in a way that had gone sour, his features sharp and his gaze appraising, like a man pricing livestock. He looked at Alara, a slow, deliberate inventory from her dusty boots to the tight line of her mouth. "New in town?" he stated. It wasn't a question. She did not answer him, her attention fixed on the storekeeper, who was now hesitating, his hand hovering over the scoop. He looked from Blevins to her, a man caught between a customer and a threat. "A scoop of oats," she repeated, her voice level. Blevins chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "She's got a voice, a quiet one." He took a step into the store, bringing the scent of whiskey and stale sweat with him. Cobb and Riley shuffled behind him, their expressions dull and imitative. "You runnin' from something, little bird, or run into it?" Alara finally turned her head to look at him, her eyes a flat, unreadable gray. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, a moment that stretched thin and tight in the stuffy air of the store. She did not flinch. She did not speak. Then she turned back to the storekeeper. The man, sweating now, finally plunged the scoop into the sack and poured the oats into a small brown paper bag with clumsy, hurried movements. She paid him her last few cents. She took the bag. As she walked past Blevins, he shifted his weight, a subtle movement meant to block her path. She stopped less than an inch from him, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She did not step around him. She waited. For a long second, nobody moved. The only sound was a fly buzzing against a dirty window pane. Then, with a smirk, Blevins stepped aside. "Polite, too," he said to her back as she walked out into the blinding sun. The door swung shut behind her. That night, the sun bled out across the horizon, staining the clouds a violent shade of purple and orange, but the heat lingered, trapped in the ground. The town came alive in a different way after dark, the yellow lamplight from the saloon spilling out onto the street, along with the discordant notes of a poorly tuned piano and the rough shouts of men. Alara sat with her back against the wall of the livery stable, in the deep shadows where the light did not reach. She had shared her small portion of hardtack with the horse, whose soft, whiskered lips had tickled her palm. Now there was nothing left. She was not hungry. The emptiness in her stomach was a familiar companion, a cold, hard knot she had learned to live with. She listened to the sounds of the town, dissecting them, understanding them. The laughter was too loud, the arguments too sharp. It was a town with a fever, a place where boredom festered into casual malice. From his small room above the forge, Silas ate his meal of beans and salted pork, the silence of his space a stark contrast to the noise from the saloon across the street. He could see the woman, Alara, from his window. He had seen the storekeeper refuse to sell her a loaf of bread earlier, claiming he was closing up, though he'd sold a bottle of whiskey to Riley not 10 minutes later. He had seen the blacksmith turn her away when she asked about mucking out stalls for a place to sleep in the hayloft. He had seen the looks, the whispers, the way the town was closing itself to her, tightening like a fist. It was a quiet sort of violence, the kind that left no bruises. He watched her now, a silhouette against the rough wood of the stable, perfectly still. He wondered what had brought her here, what she was running from that was worse than this. He had seen that kind of stillness before, in men who had been pushed to their absolute limit, who had nothing left to lose, and so had become dangerous in their calm. He saw Blevins and his men stumble out of the saloon, drunk and emboldened by the darkness. They stood for a moment in the middle of the street, their voices loud, their shapes wavering in the uncertain light. Then Blevins' head turned, and he looked directly toward the shadows of the livery. Silas felt a cold knot tighten in his own gut. He had told himself it was not his business. He had built his life on that principle. But he kept watching, his fork halfway to his mouth, the food suddenly tasteless. He watched as the three men began to walk, their steps unsteady, but their purpose clear, moving from the light into the darkness, toward the place where the woman sat alone. He put his fork down. The principle felt thin tonight. It felt like an excuse. Days later, the pattern had set. Alara found scraps of work where she could, mending a torn grain sack for a few pennies, pulling weeds from the small, dusty plot behind the church for a cold biscuit, always moving, always working with a silent, ferocious efficiency that seemed to unnerve the people who hired her. She slept in the open, near the edge of town where the last buildings gave way to the scrubland, a place no one else wanted. She did not complain, she did not beg, and she did not speak unless spoken to. Her silence a wall that Blevins and his men seemed determined to breach. They were her constant shadow, their taunts following her down the street, their laughter a punctuation to her every move. They never laid a hand on her, not yet, but their presence was a constant pressure, a promise of violence held in reserve. "Look at her, working like a dog for scraps," Blevins would call out, loud enough for half the town to hear. "Maybe she'll do a trick for us." The townspeople heard. They looked away. Their silence was a form of permission, an abdication of responsibility that left Alara utterly alone on her small, shrinking island of dignity. Silas saw it all from the doorway of his forge. He saw the way her shoulders would stiffen at the sound of their voices, but she never quickened her pace, never gave them the satisfaction of a reaction. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, quickly masked when they cornered her by the water trough, only to step aside at the last moment, laughing at her readiness to bolt. He was spending more time at the door of his forge now, his hammer idle in his hand, the fire in the coals sinking to a dull glow. He was watching. He was weighing. Every taunt they threw at her landed like a small, sharp stone in his own gut. He recognized the strategy. It was a siege. They were wearing her down, isolating her, waiting for her to break. Because her refusal to be broken was an affront to them, a challenge to the petty tyranny Blevins held over this town. One afternoon, Cobb knocked a small bundle of mended clothes from her arms, spilling them into the thick dust of the street. "Clumsy," he grunted, grinning. Alara stopped. She looked down at the clothes, then up at him, her face pale with a cold, controlled fury. For a moment, Silas was sure this would be it. He felt his own muscles tense, his hand tightening on the hammer he still held. But she did not rise to the bait. Slowly, deliberately, she knelt and began to pick up the clothes, shaking the dust from each one with meticulous care. Blevins, watching from the saloon steps, laughed. "That's it," he said. "Know your place." Silas turned and went back inside his forge, the heat suddenly suffocating. He slammed the hammer down on the anvil, a single, ringing blow that echoed through the town, a sound of pure frustration. It was not enough. He knew it was not enough. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with the promise of a storm that refused to break. The sky was a bruised, hazy gray, and the wind had died, leaving the town to swelter in a breathless, static heat. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Alara was in the livery stable, rubbing down her horse with a rough cloth. The liveryman had grudgingly allowed her to stay out of the oppressive sun in exchange for sweeping out the stalls, a task she performed with the same focused intensity she brought to everything. She worked her way around the animal, her movements economical and sure, the rasp of the cloth against the horse's coat, a steady, rhythmic sound in the quiet barn. The smell of hay and manure and warm animal was comforting, a small pocket of peace in a world that offered none. Then the light from the wide-open doorway was blocked by three familiar shapes. Blevins stood in the center, flanked by Cobb and Riley. They didn't speak at first, just watched her, their presence filling the space, sucking the air out of it. "Leave her be, Blevins," the liveryman mumbled from a dark corner, not looking up from the harness he was mending. "This is my barn." Blevins laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Don't you worry, old man. We're just making our new neighbor feel welcome." He took a step inside, his boots scuffing on the straw-strewn floor. Cobb and Riley fanned out, blocking any escape. Alara did not stop her work. She continued to rub the horse's flank, her back to them, but every muscle in her body was taut, a wire stretched to its breaking point. "I told you," Blevins said, his voice dropping to a low conversational tone that was more menacing than a shout. "I don't like quiet things. They make me nervous. I like things that make a little noise when you break them." The horse shifted, sensing the tension, its ears flattening. Alara murmured something soft to the animal, a sound too low for the men to hear, and placed a calming hand on its neck. "We made a little wager, you see," Blevins went on, circling around to face her. "Cobb here thinks you'll scream. Riley thinks you'll cry. But I think you'll just fold. I think you'll just go limp and quiet, like a doll with the stuffing knocked out." He was close now, his shadow falling over her. She finally stopped working. She straightened up slowly, turning to face him, the rough cloth still clutched in her hand. Her face was a mask of neutrality, her gray eyes betraying nothing. "Please," she said, and her voice was steady. A single hard word in the hot, still air. "Leave." Blevins' smile widened. "There's that little voice again. See? We're making progress." He reached out, as if to touch her face. The sound that happened next was not a scream or a cry. It was a sharp, wet crack. Silas had been cleaning his tools, a methodical, grounding task, wiping each one down with an oiled rag, arranging them in their proper places on the wall. But his movements were jerky, his mind not on the work. He could feel the pressure in the town, the static in the air. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his stomach, that something was about to break. He heard the liveryman's raised voice, a brief protesting squawk, followed by Blevins' ugly laugh. That was all it took. The decision was not made with thought, it was a physical impulse, a thing his body knew before his mind did. He dropped the rag and the wrench he was holding. They clattered onto the packed earth floor. He did not pick them up. He walked out of the forge and into the oppressive heat of the street, his long strides eating up the distance to the livery stable. The town was quiet, the street empty, as if everyone had gone inside to wait out the coming storm, either the one in the sky or the one in the barn. He didn't run. His pace was deliberate, measured, the walk of a man who has been to this place before and knows there is no profit in haste. He was a force of inertia, a heavy object finally set in motion, and he would not be easily stopped. As he drew closer, he heard a scuffling sound from within the barn, a grunt of pain, a heavy thud as a body hit the wooden wall. He heard a low curse. He did not hear a woman's scream. He reached the wide doorway, his own large frame filling the opening, plunging the interior into deeper shadow. He stopped on the threshold, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The scene before him was not the one he had expected, not the one he had been steeling himself to interrupt. It was over. Cobb was on his knees, clutching his face, blood seeping between his fingers from a nose that was clearly broken. Riley was slumped against a stall, dazed, a large dark bruise already purpling on his cheekbone, and Blevins was on the ground, propped up on one elbow, his other arm bent at an unnatural angle, his face a mask of disbelief and agony. Standing over them, breathing hard but upright, was Alara. Her hair was partly undone, a strand of it stuck to the sweat on her temple. There was a small bleeding cut on her lip. In her hand, held not like a tool but like a weapon, was a heavy iron hoof pick. She had not screamed, she had not cried, she had fought. She stood there in the dusty, amber light of the stable, her chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. She was not trembling. Her gaze was fixed on Blevins, a look of cold, hard finality. The hoof pick was still in her hand, its sharp point aimed loosely at the man on the ground. She was a statue of defiance carved from exhaustion and will. Silas took in the scene in a single sweeping glance. The downed men, the woman standing guard over her victory, the frightened horse shifting in its stall. He saw the story of the fight written in the scuffed dirt, the overturned bucket, the smear of blood on the wall. He had arrived to be the rescuer, the intervener, the man who puts things right. He was too late. She had put things right herself. Blevins looked up, his eyes finding Silas in the doorway. A flicker of hope, then shame, crossed his face. "Silas," he gasped, the pain making his voice thin. She's crazy. She broke my arm." Silas looked from Blevins's contorted face to Alara's still one. He saw the truth there. He saw the defensive marks on her arms, the beginning of bruises. He saw the terror she must have felt, and the strength that had burned right through it. He felt a slow, profound wave of respect wash over him, so pure and strong it was almost dizzying. He had misjudged her. The whole town had misjudged her. They had seen a victim, a stray, a thing to be pitied or preyed upon. They had not seen the iron beneath the worn cotton shirt. He took a slow step into the barn, his boots silent in the thick straw. He did not look at Blevins again. His eyes were only on Alara. He saw the slight tremor that now started in her hand, the delayed shock beginning to set in. The hoof pick wavered. He stopped a few feet from her. He did not try to touch her, did not offer a comforting word. He simply stood there, a solid, unmovable presence, a witness to her strength. "It's done," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was all that needed to be said. Blevins, clutching his broken arm, used the wall to struggle to his feet, his face pale and slick with sweat. He glared at Alara with a venomous, humiliated hatred. He opened his mouth to say something, another threat, another curse, but he looked at Silas's unreadable face, at the quiet power in his stillness, and the words died in his throat. He turned and stumbled out of the barn, followed by his two battered men, a trio of broken bullies slinking away from a fight they had started and spectacularly lost. The silence they left behind was vast and clean. Alara finally lowered the hoof pick. Her eyes met Silas's. In them, he saw not gratitude, but a flicker of grim understanding. They were the same kind of person, survivors who had learned that the only thing you could truly count on was your own will to endure. Weeks later, the town was different. The fever had broken. Blevins and his men had left 2 days after the fight in the stable, their departure as quiet and ignominious as their presence had been loud and boastful. A new, more peaceful silence had settled over the street, one born not of suspicion, but of a grudging, uncertain respect. The story of what had happened in the livery had spread, whispered from porch to porch, growing with each telling, but the core of it remained the same. The quiet girl was not weak. The townspeople looked at Alara differently now. Their gazes were no longer dismissive or predatory. They were curious, wary, some even tinged with admiration. The storekeeper now greeted her with a nod. The liveryman let her sleep in the hayloft in exchange for her steady, tireless work. She was no longer an outsider to be cast out. She was a known quantity, a person who had drawn a line in the dust and defended it. She had earned her place not by asking for it, but by claiming it. She and Silas had fallen into a rhythm of their own, a companionship of few words. She would often take her meager supper to the forge, sitting on an overturned crate just outside the punishing heat, watching him work as the evening cooled. He would share his food with her, passing her a plate without a word, and they would eat in a comfortable silence, punctuated only by the chirp of crickets and the dying hiss of the coals in the forge. He learned her story in fragments, not because she told him, but because he saw it in the way she moved. He saw the farmer's daughter in the competent way she handled the horses, the survivor in the ever-watchful set of her eyes, the fighter in the scars that mapped her knuckles, scars he hadn't noticed until he saw them up close. And she, in turn, learned him. She saw the soldier in the rigid set of his shoulders, the lonely man in the way he cared for the stray cat that lived in the rafters of his shop, the deep, banked kindness in the way he had stood in the doorway of that barn and simply bore witness, offering not rescue, but solidarity. One evening, as the last light faded, he was mending a broken chain, the tiny, intricate work straining his eyes. Alara came and stood beside him, holding a lantern so the light fell perfectly on his hands. He did not ask her to. She had just seen the need and met it. He worked for a long time, the only sounds the scrape of his file and the soft hiss of the lantern. When he was finished, he set the tool down and looked at her. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," she replied. The words were simple, but they held the weight of everything that had passed between them, a quiet acknowledgement of a debt paid and a partnership forged not in fire, but in the silent, steady recognition of another's worth. They had both been alone. They were not alone now. There is a strength that is loud, a strength that announces itself with threats and boasts, the kind that Blevins and his men thought they possessed. It is a brittle strength, a performance for the benefit of others, and it shatters at the first real test. Then there is another kind of strength, a quieter and far deeper kind. It is not a performance. It is a condition of survival. It is the strength of the rock that withstands the river, of the deeply rooted tree that endures the storm. It is the strength of a woman with nothing left to lose, who has been worn down to the hard, unbreakable core of her own will. Silas had spent a lifetime mistaking the first kind of strength for the real thing, and a lifetime building walls to protect himself from it. But in the dim light of that stable, watching Alara stand over the wreckage of men who had underestimated her, he finally understood. He saw that true resilience isn't about the blows you can deliver, but about the ones you can endure and still be standing, still be whole. Alara had not sought a fight. She had simply refused to be broken. In doing so, she had not only saved herself, she had, in a small way, redeemed the town, forcing it to look at its own casual cruelty and find it wanting. The quiet that settled over them in the following weeks was not an absence of noise, but the presence of a hard-won peace. It was the peace of a fence mended, a tool repaired, a meal shared in the twilight. It was the peace of two solitary people finding in each other a reflection of their own quiet endurance, a silent acknowledgement that the world is a hard place, but that it is possible to make a small, defensible space of dignity within it. Not with fists, not with threats, but with the simple, unshakable refusal to be anything less than what you are. That is a strength that cannot be taken away. It can only be earned. And so, we come to the end of our story, but the questions it leaves behind linger in the quiet. We all carry our own invisible histories, our own private battles that have shaped us into who we are. How often do we look at another person and see only the surface, making assumptions based on how they look, or how they speak, or how the world seems to have treated them? How often do we mistake quietness for weakness, or stillness for surrender? The world is full of people like Alara, people whose resilience has been forged in fires we will never see. They are not asking for a savior. They are only asking for the chance to stand on their own ground, to be seen for the sum of their own strength. Perhaps the greatest kindness we can offer is not to rush in to rescue, but to simply bear witness, to offer the kind of respect that says, I see you, I see your fight, and I will not stand in your way. Thank you for joining us for this story. If it resonated with you, if it made you think about the quiet strength you've seen in others or found within yourself, we hope you'll consider supporting our channel, liking this video, subscribing, or leaving a comment to share your own reflections. Helps us continue to bring these stories to life. Until next time, be well and look for the strength that lies hidden in the quiet places.